Mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue sur Afrique 24. Les fuites et les injustices fiscales dont sont victimes les gouvernements africains affectent en premier lieu les conditions des femmes en Afrique. Et selon Caroline Othim, coordinatrice pour l'ONG Global Alliance for Tax Justice, ce sont les femmes qui paient le plus d'impôts et ce sont elles qui souffrent le plus de l'absence des services publics que les gouvernements ne sont pas en mesure de financer. Mme Caroline Othim est notre invitée dans ce présent numéro de Décryptage. Pouvez-vous vous présenter et présenter votre organisation à nos téléspectateurs?
My name is Caroline Othim. I'm the Campaigns and Policy Coordinator for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. The Global Alliance for Tax Justice is an organization that brings together 5 autonomous regions to work on issues tax justice and to advocate for tax transparency in how international tax rules are implemented.
Quelles sont les sources des injustices fiscales en Afrique?
There are quite a number of tax sources of tax injustices in Africa. And first of all, I want to talk about secrecy jurisdictions, or tax havens as they're generally known. So these are basically jurisdictions where there are low tax rates or there are no taxes at all. So the wealthy elite or multinational companies get to siphon resources from developing countries to the tax havens, and they get to hide them there where their countries are unable to get access to these resources and therefore fund their development. The other source of tax injustice in Africa is what we refer to as tax planning. So tax planning is a concept that is used by a number of actors, including accountants, including banks, including the multinationals that I've talked about. So they get to look at the loopholes in the laws so that they can find ways of avoiding paying taxes. Tax avoidance is conceptually legal within the law, but it is a matter of moral issue. Therefore, at the end of the day, when these tax planners use tax planning methods to avoid paying taxes, at the end of the day, developing countries really miss out on the resources to fund their transformation. The other source of tax injustice in Africa or in developing countries as a whole is the issue of regressive tax policies. When you look at the regressive nature of a tax policy or a tax system, it means that the tax burden really is on the poor people, because it really does not matter your position in the society. You get to pay the same amount as everyone else. So at the end of the day, it's the poor people who suffer more as opposed to probably the rich people.
Quels sont les facteurs qui sont à la base de cette injustice fiscale en Afrique?
There are quite a number of factors that cause tax injustice in Africa. And I'll mention quite a number of them, 3. To begin with, I'd like to highlight the insufficient technical capacity of most tax administrations within developing countries and in Africa generally. So most tax administrations lack the capacity to sufficiently collect enough resources. And when we're looking at domestic resource mobilization, this is touted as one of the most reliable sources of government revenue to fund public services. So when tax administration do not have the capacity to collect the taxes from taxpayers, then there comes the issue of insufficient funds and the tax injustice that we are talking about. The other factor that really contributes to tax injustice in Africa is the issue of tax policies that are propagated by international financial institutions like the IMF. The IMF over the past has advised African governments to use sources of tax revenue like the VAT, which is considered a regressive tax. The reason being, it's considered as an easier tax to collect. because, as I said before, tax administrations in Africa really lack the capacity, so they will go for the low-hanging fruits, and VAT is a low-hanging fruit for most of developing countries, and therefore they use this. And at the end of the day, this brings about the issue of tax injustice within developing countries in Africa.
Quel est le lien entre les fuites fiscales et la question du genre?
Now, the discourse on gender and tax is an emerging area, and it's a key issue that really we need to bring to the fore, because tax itself is a gender issue, and it affects women's rights in two ways. One way is on how tax is raised, and on the other hand is how much tax is actually raised. So when we're looking at how much tax is raised, we are looking at, is there enough resources that the government can be able to use to fund public services that would go towards uplifting the position of women in the society. When you're looking at access to clean water, when you're looking at education, healthcare provision, most of the time it's women who really bear that burden. The other connection between tax and gender issues and women's rights is the fact that there's that disproportionate tax burden on women when we are looking at most of the tax policies within Africa, when we're looking at the regressive nature of it. So it tends to affect women because women are considered to be more marginalized, and they live and they occupy most of the lower quintile of the poor people. So women really get impacted much more. The other reason is the fact that when you're looking at childcare and even decent jobs for women, when countries lack enough resources to provide childcare facilities, it's women who will leave their well-paying jobs to stay back at home to take care of their kids. So at the end of the day, they get to miss out on what they could have contributed to building the economy by contributing to the workforce. The other connection between tax and women's rights is the issue of governments getting now to depend more on development aid and debt to fund their cooperation. So at the end of the day, women are impacted much more by the regressive nature of taxes. And I also want to mention that when you're looking at the discourse of tax and gender, the issue of data is really critical, because increasingly we have found that there is no data to really help us advocate for these issues, and therefore more research really needs to be carried out so that we get gender disaggregated data to support the work that we do.
Et quelles solutions pour remédier à cela?
So some of the reforms or some of the strategies that we can look at to address the gendered impacts of taxation would include conducting and carrying out gender impact assessments of all tax-related fiscal policies. Beyond that, developing countries and African governments can be able to carry out gender progressive budgeting, so that in our budgets we are able to really ensure that we take into consideration the needs of both women and men in how our government's budget. The other reform agenda would be for African governments to be able to curb illicit financial flows. So when I'm talking about tax evasion, tax avoidance, this constitutes the illicit financial flows, which research shows Africa loses up to around $50 billion per year. This was according to a report that was released in 2015. The current data reveals that the figure has gone up. It has doubled to around $100 billion. So African governments need to curb illicit financial flows so that the money that would have been lost through the illicit financial flows can be channeled back to provide the much needed public services that would benefit women.